All right, students, so we're going to continue with reproduction, and I'm going to give you some notes on sexual reproduction today. And basically, we're comparing the two types. That's why this first slide says asexual versus sexual. Same TEK I showed you the other day. Basically, that's what it says, comparing the results, right? Uniform or diverse offspring from either one of the types of reproduction. I always ask students about that picture and what they think that is, and I have a lot of different answers. I have some students that say, "Oh, that's sperm," or they say that's a tadpole, or sometimes a fish. Um, it's definitely a vertebrate. That's an animal with a backbone, and it could be an amphibian, but it also could be a fish. And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's definitely not a reptile, bird, or mammal, and not a sperm. So there are two types of reproduction, right? Asexual and sexual. So the top is basically what you usually think of with asexual reproduction. One-celled organism splitting in half and becoming two. Here's the one, the process of splitting, and then they become two different organisms. Well, actually, they're exact copies, but two separate organisms. And then sexual reproduction, and starting with sex cells, egg and sperm, and then you get offspring. Okay, so we're going to focus on sexual reproduction on these notes, and we're going to look at some things that are in common with sexual reproduction. Then we'll look at some of the advantages of this type of reproduction, and then some of the disadvantages of this type of reproduction as it relates to organisms in general. Right. So the first thing about sexual reproduction that you have to know, and it's the main difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, is that sexual reproduction involves fertilization. Right. Fertilization is the joining of that sperm and egg, joining of the sex cells to make a new cell. Right. You have the egg, the sperm, and then you have the sperm penetrating the egg. That's when fertilization occurs. You have the uniting of the chromosomes at that moment, and it becoming a new cell, and then it begins to divide into multiple cells. So that's fertilization, when they join together and create that new cell. Typically involves sex cells from two parents, right? So typically means that's usually the way it works. However, I've already shown you an example of an organism in the planaria where you have both sex cells coming from the one parent, but that's still considered sexual reproduction because there's still fertilization taking place. Offspring are going to be different from the parents, and I mentioned this briefly the other day, but those differences, the diversity, is not always outwardly apparent. You're not always going to see those differences. If it's an organism that we see on a daily basis, like a mound of ants, all those ants are going to look exactly the same. There's slight differences. There's differences because of the joining of the two sex cells. Right? So you're going to have some variation, even if it's not a lot. There is going to be some differences. That variation allows for adaptation, right? So that's one of the adaptations we'll talk about. And then leads to natural selection. That's another one of the advantages we'll talk about. So advantages. The first one says the variation. Those are the differences. That's why I have it in the parentheses. Allows for adaptation, right? So differences, like I think this is called a peacock bass, and you can see they're not all the same, and it probably depends on where they're located, maybe geographically or whatever, but it's the same species, but you have variation that helps them adapt to their unique surroundings. And you see some kind of simple examples here. So a litter of puppies, they're not all clones of each other, right? Every one of those puppies got a different combination of genes from the parents, and so they don't all look like just exact copies of each other. They're similar, but they're not clones. And the same thing with these litter of cats. Again, these are kind of simple examples, but you do see variation. Now, I'll tell you just as a side note, right? These three and even this one, these kittens kind of look the same, and these two kind of look similar. They're all from the same litter, but with cats, it's different than dogs. A female cat can actually breed with multiple males while she is going through her cycle there, and then give birth to different kittens from different males. So she can have all those, the kittens could have different fathers, in other words, from the same litter. Right? Whereas dogs, it doesn't work that way. It's going to be one father, and that's it. So that's a strategy from cats, and that's a reproductive strategy that ensures that at least the female's trying to ensure that she gets at least some good genetics in her litter. By breeding with multiple males, she's ensuring that. Another advantage is leads to natural selection. Now, we haven't talked about natural selection yet, but we are going to be pretty soon. Natural selection means that good traits, right? Those traits that work for an offspring, that's what good means in parentheses, right? Are passed on and strengthen the species, which then increases the survival rate of the species, right? We're talking about nature. It's never usually about the individual. We're talking about this kind of thing. It's usually what helps the species, right? The population. Those good traits passed on and strengthen the species, increasing the survival rate. That's what natural selection is. Here's a kind of fairly common example of that. So giraffes that didn't get the longest neck genes from their parents probably weren't able to compete and get the browse from the very top branches, and so those that do have the longest necks end up surviving and then passing on those genes to their offspring, right? They're passing on the long neck genes. That's what that's showing you in that picture. There are some disadvantages to sexual reproduction. And it says requires 2 sex cells, right? So we already knew that, the egg and sperm. So that means it's usually 2 parents, which that means then you have to find a mate, right? And with humans, that's not a difficult thing, right? We have no issues with finding mates, but if you look at it from the perspective of other organisms, sometimes organisms have huge territories, have to wander a great distance just to find a mate. Sometimes they have to, males especially, battle for the right to mate, and that can be kind of a serious thing, could even lead to death in some species. Like these lions look like they're pretty serious about who's going to get to mate with the females there. So that can be a very stressful thing. Finding a mate, not all individuals get to mate. Usually it's a dominance thing with in nature like that, so that can be a disadvantage. Another one is it's a much slower, much more complex, and much less reliable process than asexual reproduction. Now, we haven't gone through the details of asexual reproduction, but once we do, you'll see the notes tomorrow. You'll know, yes, that's a quicker process, much more reliable. With sexual reproduction, it's not always so reliable, and it's definitely not as quick a process. Now, some organisms, it doesn't take as long. And I gave you just vertebrates here, right? So we're starting with a bird there, and it says gestation or / incubation period, because with a bird, it's not gestation. Gestation means it would be like a pregnancy. Incubation means the bird's having to sit on the eggs, right, for that amount of time. So 10 to 14 days, that's just a simple house sparrow, very common bird, small songbird like that. That doesn't seem like a long time, but it is still a time when the female has to sit on those eggs and incubate, right? That's 2 weeks. And then on top of that, then another 2 weeks of raising the babies, getting food for them, getting them to the point where they leave the nest, right? And even after that, the babies might be following them around for another week or two, trying to learn the ropes. So it's a fairly big investment on these organisms, and that is nothing compared to, say, a dog. So domestic dog, 8 to 10 weeks, that the female is carrying the babies. Humans, we have 40 weeks our gestation period, so that's pretty cumbersome there. Look at the blue whale, 55 to 60 weeks. Now we're talking about over a year. And then the African elephant, unbelievable, almost 2 years that the female is pregnant and carrying that baby around before she gives birth. That is a long, drawn-out, complex process, and I mentioned this the other day also. Countless numbers of species have gone extinct because they do not have an efficient means of reproduction. All right, some examples of reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Most animals, right? So I just threw in some typical examples: a fly, a human, snake, frog. So frog, there's a frog, there's lemurs, and there's a snake, and then there's the fly up there. So most of your animals are reproducing sexually, although some can reproduce asexually also. These are typical examples of sexually reproducing animals. But not only animals, plants, and maybe you didn't realize this, but all flowering plants and those that make seeds reproduce sexually. Daffodil, the grass, rose, oak tree, all these flowering plants are considered sexually reproducing, and most of those flowering plants have to use something like an insect or a hummingbird or something like that to help them pollinate. And it's not sperm and egg, but it's the pollen, and then it's the stamen, the pistil. You have those male and female parts on each of the flowers, and well, not always, but some plants actually have a male plant and a female plant, but it's still sexual reproduction and the joining of those sex cells, right? So your modern flowering plants, but also things like grasses and some trees also. I put in a passage from the book on what is sexual reproduction and fertilization. You got the reading function here if you need that. You've got a slide to answer some questions, so make sure you finish those and add these slides to your notebook.